we see, the thing is, respect is earned, honor is given. And what I mean by that is that from personal experience, you might respect someone or not respect them. Maybe they don't have the integrity. Maybe there are things about them that they've done where you really question. And so sometimes we can be in situations where personally we don't necessarily have respect. As I mentioned, there can be people who didn't know who Jesus was. And yet, that being said, honor can be given freely to anybody. Honor for who they are, for the position they're in. Again, as a president, we can still honor them, and we can show respect to them for the very fact of who they are, or the position that they're in. And yet, not necessarily. It's not a conflict saying, well, I can't show respect because I don't respect you. No, we have to be able to do it. And when we choose not to honor, we end up having the opposite effect. Because when you honor someone, it builds them up. When you honor someone, it believes in the best of the person or the position. It values someone for who they are. When the opposite is the dishonor, it tears down. It believes the worst. It devalues the person and what's going on. And if you want to know how does that apply necessarily in your life, think about a relationship in which you wish was better. And the question you'd have is that in that relationship, are you honoring that person? Thinking of that person of being someone as God sees as the best of that person? Or are you dishonoring them, disrespecting them in the way that you treat, and you wonder it's not why they're not great because of the way in which you treat that person? If you want a common, ordinary, insignificant marriage, then just continue to dishonor your spouse. There was a speaker, a woman, I should say, at a conference with her husband who was a speaker, and she had said she was sitting in a group of women, and they were just talking, and one of the women was just continually disrespecting her husband in the things that she was saying. And this particular woman finally said, she says, I just had to say something. So she says, that's really not the way that you should be talking about your husband. The woman responded back to her saying, well, if my husband was like even half the man your husband was, I wouldn't be talking to him like that. To which she says, I just quickly responded back to him and says, maybe my husband is half the man you're describing because I do honor him. That in fact, by showing honor, I do raise up the quality of our relationship and our marriage as well. I'm going to pick on her because in our leaders meeting, Lisa Henson is walking around with a Saints shirt. Now, those who don't know her husband, Richard, he's a Saints fan. Like a fanatical Saints fan. And so, she doesn't really care for football that much or anything. She says, but I'm wearing it for him. I said to her, that's a great example of honoring your spouse. Doing something maybe you don't necessarily care so much, but you do it for the sake of your spouse because you want to honor them at that moment. And so, again, the truth in here is that understanding that a life without honor can devalue that which deserves that honor. But the second truth in here, and maybe one we really want to be able to focus on certainly in what's going on, is that a life without honor diminishes the presence of God's power. Notice here in verse 5, it says here that that it says after he said that there was a prophet without honor and they were the way they were treating him, he says he could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. It doesn't say he would not. It's not like Jesus responded saying, if you're going to treat me that way, then fine, I'm not doing anything. The translation is very correct in what it says, is that he could not do anything. Now, knowing who Jesus was, in some ways, I don't know that I'd ever fully understand, because I'm thinking, well, now wait a minute. Jesus is God. He can do whatever he wants. And so I don't totally understand how that necessarily worked, other than to know that there's a connection between the way in which we honor or dishonor and our own faith and our own relationship and the way, in fact, God works in our life. Jesus himself in verse 6, then he says, and he was amazed at their lack of faith. Jesus took their way in which they dishonored him and connected that to the relationship of faith that the people had, that their connection between their spiritual faith that happens. In other words, he's saying this, where there's a lack of honor, there's a lack of faith. And when there's a lack of honor and faith, there's a lack of the presence of God's power at work. That's the connection that we understand when we're thinking about a forgotten virtue of honor, that we're seeing that there's a diminishing of the presence of God's power in our life. An example would be Malachi 2:2, which says this. Malachi is a story of, in fact, we just did Nehemiah. It happened the same time as Nehemiah, but it was a story of how Israel was kind of disobedient to God, and God was, the prophet was, addressing what was going on there. And so it says in verse 2, it says this, "If you do not listen, and if you do not set your heart to honor my name, says the Lord Almighty, I will send a curse upon you, and I will curse you blessings. Yes, I have already cursed them, because you have not set your heart in honor to honor me." Now, the curse in that context was really a withholding of God's blessing, that their crops were not, growing and things were not happening. Why? Because they were dishonoring God. And their dishonoring of who God was and His name removed the power of God at work in their life to offer them kind of blessing that they had. God couldn't work in a faithless place, or wasn't willing to work in a faithless place. And so we see in this context, though, that living a life without honor is living a life without the power of God at work. That in some way God allows us to fall into our own folly, if you go with Proverbs, because of our lack of honor in the way we live. And so the solution then is to live a life of honor when we look at what Jesus is trying to get across. And so I want to spend the last part of this then talking about who we're called to honor. Who are then, if we're living a life of honor, what does it really mean to live that life? How do we live the honor in the way God called, and who is it we're supposed to show honor to? And Scripture gives us a few examples I want to look at. First of all, we honor our parents. Exodus 20, kids listen. Exodus 20:12 says, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land of the Lord your God has given you." Now, hope if the parents have now shut off their mind thinking, "Oh, okay, tell them, Pastor." If you still have parents around, it applies to you as well. They might not be living in their home or anything, but this idea of honoring your parents is very straightforward to what God is saying, and it's something that doesn't, until they're, of a certain age, or until you don't never need them anymore, or it doesn't say that at all. In fact, it's you honor your parents always. I grew up in an age where there was a lot of sirs and ma'ams. I grew up, I sound like I'm old, and I don't want to make it sound that way, but I definitely sounded a Mr. and Mrs. I can remember families that I, hung out with my friends, and it was always a Mr. or a Miss. There was never just a first name basis. And I also remember as an adult, when kids would start talking to me and they would say Mr. Humphreys, I would say, that's my dad. Call me Mark. I mean, we kind of were a generation at our own. We are responsible for the diminishing of honor when it comes to parents. We ourselves did that because we went to our kids and said, "Oh no, you can call them first name," and all our friends are, my kids call it first name, and hats off to the school systems and some others where at least they add now the miss to it, and because they're trying to teach kids that you need to honor, people, and certainly it starts with our parents. And we live in a society that devalues the role of a parent. If you don't know that that's true, then sit down and watch one of the shows your kids watch. My daughter, I've said about it, and we've talked about it, that in these shows, most of the parents, for lack of a better word, are pretty stupid. And the kids always have a smart comment. They roll their eyes like, "Oh, my dumb dad," or whatever. And I know it's great for a laugh, but it devalues the role of a parent. And it has that kind of an impact. And so, it's not surprising we have, kids who will talk back, or kids that will not respond to what your parents want, or when the parents ask you to do something where, it's just them, or I'll do it later, or whatever. When that happens, you dishonor them. Honoring someone does not mean you even have to necessarily respect them. Maybe you are in a situation where your parent has not been a good parent. Maybe they make a lot of mistakes. You're not saying they're perfect or anything like that. That's not at all what God is saying when He calls us to honor our parents. You're honoring the position that God has put them in. You're honoring the role that they have. And you're not condoning their behavior even necessarily at that time. But we're called to honor our parents and show that respect to them for who they are. The second one is those in authority, which kind of ties a little bit that, but goes beyond just the parents. Romans 13 says this, "Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. And then it goes on to say, give everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay it taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Now what's interesting in Romans, he's not talking about Christian leaders. He's not saying, oh, go to the governor if he's a Christian. He's talking about the leaders that are non-Christian, that in many of them persecuting Christians, that God put in authority. He says, respect the office is what God is really saying. Respect those that are in authority. And so we need to ask ourselves, who are the ones in authority over you? Kids, who are the ones in authority over you? It could be your teachers. It could be a coach that you have in sports that is, for adults, it could be bosses that you have. Other people that are in positions of authority, the law enforcement, when they pull you over. It could be any one of those in positions of authority that we are called to show honor and respect for the office in which they are. And to not do so is to really sin against what God has called us to. I find this one abused a lot. And I'm guilty as much as anybody, particularly in the political world. I mean, we are so tired of the ads. I'm sure, maybe a few of you, hands of those who still want more ads. We can't wait for the election to come. But sometimes our comments go over the line into an area of disrespect. I mean, I can remember conversations, even the point where my brother, back in the Clinton and the Bush era, where he wouldn't talk to me for a year because we had lunch and I made a joke about something. I don't even remember what it was. But he took it very seriously. And in all fairness, I think my joke was kind of a disrespectful joke. Now, he was over the line in some of the stuff he said and did too. But I remember saying that, I don't agree at all with the choices that, as a president he was making. And yet he's my president. And as such, he deserves my respect and my honor for the role that he has. Not that personally I respect him, maybe. There's obviously some stuff there. But as the office, we are to show respect for that office. And that can go into other areas as well. God has called us to show honor to those in authority, and we need to look around us and say, who are the ones in authority around us that we need to be able to honor? If it's a teacher, you respect them in the way they are. You don't talk behind their back or joke about them. No matter what's going on, you honor them for who they are and the role that they have. And that honors God when you do that. The third one, and this is a little more sensitive, it's our pastors and our church leaders. It is awkward because, I'm one of them. But it's nonetheless important. And in fact, it's very serious when you look into Scripture about what God says. 1 Timothy 5:17. I had to search a lot for the verses. No, I didn't. The elders who direct the affairs of the church are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. I was involved in an assessment of a church last year down in Southern California. And those assessments we've done one ourselves where a group of people come in and you kind of, the church is struggling, there's conflict going on usually or something. And so we come in and we interview different groups and different things, individuals and as a group and the leaders and the pastor. And basically through our gathering of information, we kind of determine what's going on here. And then we come out with recommendations based on, what they had said. So our recommendations come out of the things we discover. We don't come in with some book and say, hey, this is what you ought to do. We just observe and tie it to Scripture. In this particular one, they didn't like their pastor. And they had reasons that they would share openly why they didn't like their pastor. And then, of course, they didn't like the leaders as a result of it. And so on and on and on, there was complaint about, and they were shifting the blame to leadership, they were shifting the blame to the pastor. Anyway, at the end, we stood up when we gave them a report and said, you know what, you dishonor your leaders. And there's no question God's blessing is being withheld from you based on the way in which you're treating your leaders. You might not like them. You might have issues the way they lead or any of those kind of things, but they are in a role of leadership, and therefore they are deserving of being honored for the role that they have. It's not always an easy job, and it certainly, in many times, is a job that can be very burdensome and very struggling and difficult. And so we are called to show respect to those in positions of authority and leadership within the church. The